Oh, g'day champions. We're back with this Teisco. God, so many hours. I've got to stop doing these full-on redesigns, rebuilds, because they just destroy my life for like multiple weeks trying to catch up afterwards, because they take multiple days of just piss farting around trying to redesign a really shit amp to make it somewhat usable. So let's start from the power supply. The original cap's left in place, but we changed the grounding scheme. We changed the droppers because that was a big, huge resistor just flopping around and had already fractured its leads once and was likely to do it again. So I mounted the equivalent values, which adds up to 10k or 11k in that case. The original was 10k. That's a massive dropper for the screens, and part of the reason that this thing's got so much sag and compression. I've added some backup diodes to the rectifier there. We've got the new transformer in there. That's a Hammond 290 MAEX, which crosses all the I's and dots all the T's. Redid all the heater wiring because there was no balancing. There was no twisting to any of them. The wire routing was ridiculous, went right parallel to signals. Put a IEC connector in there, so I had to excavate the rear panel there with a nibbler, and then my nibbler broke, so that went in the bin, and I finished it off with a file. Redid all the wiring so it was mains compliant. That was well, yeah, you saw it in the last video. It was not ideal. Changed the standby switch to be an actual HT switch. Moved the main filter cap to before that standby switch, so there's no inrush on the rectifier valve. Left this one in place because I was able to mount it rather rigidly, and that was about half the size of the 10k dropper that was there before. Changed the whole ground scheme. You can see a lot of wiring back there. That's the different nodes coming from the power supply up that end. Redid pretty much everything on the output sockets because there was seriously dumb shit there. Put some flyback diodes there, some grid stoppers to try and keep the hiss and the RF down. Oh god, what else did we do? Rewired the output transformer because that was dangerous and had exposed HT that the user could touch. Did what we could to all of this stuff. It's a lot neater than it was, and there's a lot of stuff that I've changed to make it just less susceptible to noise. There's still quite a bit of hiss just from the crazy architecture of this thing. It's just so insane. Whoever built it, like, it just, yeah, I don't know. Who knows? Whoever designed that thing. I'll show you the schematic shortly. Down this end, I've put 2 isolated jacks so there wasn't like 10 ground loops in the thing. That goes via that coax that's tucked in there, that white wire, and that goes off to the main grounding point. Come on, Panasonic, don't make me throw you at a wall, because I'm in the mood to do that today. I've put some new switchcrafts on there, or new jacks all around, because they were so corroded and manky. That is now our main grounding point. These are just for the reverb and the tremolo pedals. So I've actually dremeled off some paint so we actually have a good actual connection actually. There's been a lot of component value changes just to be a bit more logical, and drop the gain a little bit. It just had stupid amounts of gain, and massive amounts of noise and hum as a result, and it's just super sensitive, and there was just wires crossing over all sorts of shit, and crosstalk and oscillation and you name it. So most of that's addressed now. I've sort of pulled the pin on it a little bit because we've spent so much time on it, and this guy plays pretty much noise rock anyway, so he doesn't care if it's a little bit noisy in the background, so we're not going to redesign the whole thing. I just don't have time. Way better than it was, and we'll show you some sound samples shortly. Alright champions, this thing's been cooking for a few hours. Seems to be all stable. There was like 3 other things wrong with it after putting it back together. It seemed like it would be fine, and then you'd put it in the cabinet and only then something would play up. That happened like 3 times, and it was like, I've went over just about every single solder joint in this thing, bar like 3 of them, and they were the ones that gave me problems. There was the grid leak on the phase inverter. The lead was corroded in the eyelet. Another tag strip snapped off, so I had to bypass that. It's like, it works perfectly on the bench. As soon as you put it in the cabinet and screw it together, that's when it fails. Oh man, I think from now on we're just gonna refuse any amplifiers unless the architecture has a true proven track record, because this thing was just so poorly designed that large sections of it just had to be rethought out from square one and basically redone completely, just to get it even where it is now. And it's still noisy because the architecture is just absolutely stupid. But it's not a conventional amp, it's not a conventional musician that owns it, so it'll suit him fine. Now it's reasonably quiet, there's a bit of hiss you can probably hear there. We've got it to a small amount of hum. There is some hum as you bring up the channel 1 because it's over near the power supply area. That ground is isolated up this end and it's tied back to the ground up here, where it reconnects back to the power supply. So that's about as good as we can get the grounding scheme without this architecture. Inputs at both ends is just a bad idea. Everything's running past the transformer. You got massive heater runs, massive signal runs. It's just a recipe for disaster, and that's pretty much what this thing is, a disaster. So anyway, it's working. I put it back together. It works with the reverb tank, the test reverb tank on the bench, which is the same type you'd find in any AB763 type circuit, or pretty much any Fender circuit for that matter, valve circuit anyway. It worked with that reverb tank, so everything in the circuit's okay. There was some oscillation when you push it real hard because this pot seems to max out at like 1.6, 1.7 meg instead of 1 meg. So it's probably partially the pot's fault. It's also the big signal runs there, and just stuff being next to other stuff that shouldn't be. As you saw in the chassis details, the valves are laid out, the tubes are laid out sort of like a grid, and it's not a good idea either. You've got crosstalk all over the place. Everything's talking to everything else, or because of the layout, and there's no way to really change that in this thing without stripping the whole thing and drilling new things and coming up with a whole new concept. So yeah, it's not happening. So I put it back together, and the reverb doesn't work in this one because there's something wrong with the tank. The tank ohms out okay, but I don't know if one of the transducers has physically failed or what. I can't get the tank out without destroying the rubber mounts that it's on, and they're not your typical rubber mounts. They're these large, huge donut grommet-y things, which I don't want to disturb because that'll just be another thing that we're going to have to reverse engineer and build something to, So just hours and hours and hours and hours of trying to reverse engineer it, engineer new solutions, trying to go not so extreme the first time, then finding out that that's not adequate, going a little bit more extreme each time until you've fully redesigned the circuit. But then still trying to keep it similar to the original circuit for its character. No more weird amps, because one of these sets me back 2 or 3 days and I just never catch up. It never happens, and the queue just gets longer and longer, and people get angrier and angrier and more impatient. So I can't handle that. It's stressful and it makes life not very fun at all. So from now on, I think amplifiers with known architectures, major brands, everything else that's weird, unless it's simple, you can just go to some hobbyist somewhere that can afford to spend days and days on it, because they don't have 20 amps a week coming in. That's pretty much the way it's got to be from now on, unfortunately. But anyway, it's sounding okay. Bit of a noise floor, hiss. I'll show you a little bit of the schematic and just how insane this thing is, and then we'll get into some sound samples. You can see the controls, you'll know where everything's set. There's no controls on the rear except for the power. And yeah, you'll get a sound of this weird thing, aside of course from the reverb. Alright legends, let's have a look at this crazy thing. This is a schematic someone's traced out by hand. Nicely drawn schematic, whoever did it knew what they were doing. I've confirmed that it's all correct. They've done a really good job, very accurate, very clear. That's how schematics should be. So, channel 1, mic and guitar input. This is what we played through. This is going to be the last samples towards the end of the sound samples. You got 100k grid stoppers. I could have changed them down to get noise a bit lower, but the hiss is coming from later on, so the hiss introduced by these two was pretty insignificant compared to the crazy gain structure later on. By flicking this switch, you're going in bass mode straight through this 250k, which is more series resistance to add noise, and then through a high pass filter here, or you're clicking over to this cap and you're going through that. That's the guitar mode, so that acts as more high pass filtering. It's just craziness. There was no. This is in grid leak bias, so that's a 5 meg. Well, normally you'd see like a 1 meg or a 500k there or something, and you'd have a cathode resistor and bypass cap there to bias the valve, but they're relying on the space charge to bias this thing. So I got rid of that and put a bypass cap in there and changed that to, I think, a 1 meg. The EQ I left pretty much untouched. It's not ideal, but it is what it is. As for this one, you've got the more conventional cathode bias setup. You've got hard and soft. So hard is just, again, high pass. And you've got 200k grid stoppers here as well as another filter stage there. Just wacky design. The tremolo controls the voltage on this cathode, so that sends that valve into cutoff via the oscillator, which is on another page. That's a way of doing it. It's a cheap way of doing it, and it's got a lot of side effects. So your gain and it'll introduce sort of like a sag, which I probably didn't really demonstrate on the video, but when this tremolo is turned off, even when the foot switch or dummy plug's not even plugged in, you're changing the tone by changing that depth control, because it's changing the bias of this stage. So it's not very isolated. There's better ways to do it, but they didn't know that back then. Because you're getting some thumping from this tremolo after the EQ, which is identical to this EQ, same values and everything, I think, is it? Yep, 500 picofarad. Yeah, so exactly the same EQ for both sides. Same volume control, but here you're getting, or they're taking a reverb drive split off there via a 250k resistor, and then you've got some high pass filtering here to try and get rid of the thump introduced from the tremolo, and then that pisses off to the power amp. So just quickly, here's the wacky reverb drive. Again, you've got, well, this is a strange way of doing it. I don't even want to look at this schematic anymore. It's just so weird. So instead of having the reverb feeding straight into the recovery stage, well, you're always getting output from this valve. In a Fender type circuit, the reverb's feeding straight into the grid. But what you're actually doing when you're controlling the reverb is you're controlling the output of this valve and how much is making it back to the stage, rather than this valve being wide open all the time with its 250k. I reduced that to 100k to reduce the hiss, and the gain was out of control. That calmed things down a bit, but the circuit's just wacky. And up here you got a mix. You've got power amp in that comes from the essentially the preamp outputs, where they mix together via the 100k resistors, and then this mix is on the next stage with the reverb, and then you're tempted to think this is the phase inverter. It ain't. This is the phase inverter. What does that look similar to? If you get rid of that cap, it's pretty much identical almost, if that was 1 meg, to a 5E3 phase inverter, a cathodione. So here you've got the inverting output feeding into pin 1 and the not inverting output feeding into pin 4. So this 6SN7 is working like a buffer into the 6L6s. So this is just that crazy setup. You probably could have, if you bypass that, you might not have enough gain for the 6L6s, but it would easily drive 6V6s, which is how the Deluxe does its thing. And this was the previous standby switch, which just nulled out the two inputs to the output valves. And you got your 210 ohm cathode resistor and 10 microfarad. I think someone had put a
is that 10 or 100? I can't remember. I think it was a 25 that was in there. Then your 250k grid leaks there. So yeah, I mean, this is pretty typical, I guess. I changed it because I was working on the thing so much and taking so many measurements. I just moved that to the HT like a normal one. That's fine. Having it there is not an issue. It wasn't cutting off all the signal though, probably because something's out of balance. Here's your tremolo oscillator, about as simple as you can get, and that pisses off to the cathode in the preamp of the tremolo channel. Here you can see they've simplified it to show that it's I can't remember the bloke's name. Colpitts? No. I can never remember oscillator names. Anyway, someone will tell me in the comments and tell me I'm a dickhead. Fair enough. I am a dickhead. So, it had the 5AR4 there, GZ34, and it had two 6.3 windings. This was just, this wasn't the transformer that it had. It only had a 100 volt transformer. It didn't have the international one. It only had one primary winding. So whoever had this amplifier here had the international version, I guess. I replaced this transformer with a 290 MAEX from Hammond, and that only had one 6.3 volt winding, but it was 5 amp, so we still matched up. And there was no, as you can see here on the original, there was no heater balancing at all. In fact, they grounded one side of it, so the other one was way out of whack. That was to the 6L6s. I don't think they had any ground reference at all, actually, to be honest, which is just, again, crazy. That's why it was humming like a bastard, along with all the ground loops and just all the other layout issues and stuff. This is just a... it was such a DIY looking amp. Yeah, I won't... I can lose a lot of hair, and you guys can learn from that hair loss. You guys can keep your hair, alright? So watch this channel and know what not to do and how not to run a business. I'm going to show you that. That's all I can offer, really, these days. I can show you what not to do. So someone had replaced the can caps. That wasn't bad. I had to replace one of the brackets because there was like a kilometre of gaff tape around it because their bracket was too big. So I replaced that with a 35mm bracket. Had to go to JCar and get that today because I forgot about it and wasn't doing an order with CE till, I don't know, later in the month. And I want this thing done. So I went up to JCar. Story time. Went up to JCar and they had the brackets in a drawer with capacitors, and they had those shitty suntan caps that suck. They blow up or go open circuit. And I asked, do you do these brackets just by themselves? He goes, no, you got to buy them with a cap. And I go, well, I don't want the cap. And they're like, we don't care, you got to buy the cap. I go, well, I'll tell you what, I'll buy the cap to get the bracket, and you can keep the cap because I don't want the fucking cap. He's like, okay. And he charged me $12.95 for a fucking electrolytic capacitor bracket. But that's the price you pay when you want the job out the door. So, so anyway, I just thought you might like a look at that circuit. I think we had a brief look at it in the last time, but I understand it better now that I've actually had my head into it. And she's pretty similar to how it was, but I've made quite a lot of changes. The topology is essentially the same, but each stage has been optimized as much as I could without affecting the function of the thing. Yeah. Anyway, let's never speak of this again. Going to the soft input. I'll stick the dummy plug in for the tremolo. Go, say midway. There's a little bit of thumping there, but as we saw on the schematic, it's got some pretty hectic high pass filtering to try and get rid of that, but there's still a little bit there. Unplug it and it stops. Problem solved. As for the other side, the mic input's pretty meh. Bass pots are kind of the wrong taper. They only kick in from 0 to say 3, and there's no change for the rest of the pot travel. Whereas the treble pot's a bit more gradual. Go on to the guitar input, so you've got a bass or guitar switch. That's the guitar input. That's a bass input, so it's got a lot more bass response there, and the guitar's a lot more toppy. So there you go. Let's get this thing out of my shop. I'm sick of looking at it. So until the next one, take it easy, legends. Talk to you then.